everyone. I'm Diane Foster. I'm the director of the School of Marine Sciences and Ocean Engineering here at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm here to welcome you today to our Celebrating Women Ocean Mappers panel and story. And we have a great feature author that we're going to be talking with, and then a panelist. And right now I'd like to introduce my colleague who is the director of the Leitzel Center, Julie Bryce. Julie, take it away.
Hi, Diane. Thanks for kicking us off. I was having some computer difficulties, so it just shows that it's great to work with a team who can help cover things. So we're just here today to celebrate its International Day of Women and Girls in Science, and we let engineering and technical friends in, as well as those who tell the story of women scientists. And we're sort of use this day as an opportunity to share the work that a local artist has written in terms of describing Marie Tharp, who's a famous oceanographer that many people probably have never heard of. So we're sort of have this organized where Josie James is going to tell us a little bit about the story and then read some from the book, and then she'll move on into, and then we'll move on and meet two PhD students who are studying oceanography. One has been up to the top of the world to study the oceans there, and the other's been down to the bottom of the ocean and submarines to study the oceans in that way. So we hope you'll be able to ask questions of them as well. So I'll let, I think we can take the next slide and let Josie James tell us about Marie Tharp and what she learned.
Okay, well, I think this quote is my favorite from Tharp, and she says, "I had a blank canvas to fill with extraordinary possibilities, a fascinating jigsaw puzzle to piece together. It was a once in a lifetime, a once in the history of the world opportunity for anyone, but especially for a woman in the 1940s. And I think that says it all. If we go to the next slide, this is the cover of the book, and I'll just give you a brief overview of the story. Marie Tharp earned a graduate degree in geology in the 1940s at a time when scientific careers were largely unavailable to women. Marie's vision, expertise, and tenacity paved the way for her to become one of the greatest oceanographic cartographers of the 20th century. She was the first person to map the ocean floor and discover the 40,000-mile-long mid-ocean ridge in Raleigh. Her astounding discovery supported the theory of continental drift, which led to the theory of plate tectonics. But it was not an easy road, and Marie struggled to receive the credit she deserved. From Marie Tharp's early childhood dreams all the way to her defining achievement, this is the story of one of Earth science's greatest hidden figures. And just a quick, before I move to reading the story, I decided to write this book because I was scrolling through somewhere, I think it was perhaps Facebook, and I saw this article in Smithsonian about Marie Tharp, and I was shocked that I didn't know who she was. And I was even more shocked how little I knew about the ocean floor and about plate tectonics and continental drift. So I became addicted, and as they call those who love Marie Tharp, I became a Tharpophile, and couldn't stop until I wrote this story. And thankfully, my editor, Christy Ottaviano, went along for this ride and let me make the book. So let's read a bit. Okay, it's story time, folks. I know the scientists love story time. Do we have the next slide? All right. Is this really what it looks like at the bottom of the sea, Miss Tharp? Are there really mountains? Yes, there are mountains and valleys and plains just like you see on land. For most of history on maps of the world, the ocean was flat, featureless, and unchanging. The World Ocean Floor Panorama is the first map ever made that shows this underwater landscape. And you made it? I did. I am an oceanographic cartographer. I mapped all the oceans in the world. That's amazing. How come I've never heard of you? Sometimes people do amazing things and no one remembers their names. Then why did you do it? Didn't you want to be famous? That's a great question. I guess I wanted to do something important, not be someone important. Did you always know how to make maps, Miss Tharp? No, when I was a child, I never dreamed that I would grow up to map the ocean floor. I'm going to move through. It's in sections, so I try to achieve some continuity. In the early 1900s, women were still considered bad luck aboard ships, even after science had disproved the myths. Sometimes it's hard to convince people to believe something new. I like to discover new things. So did Alfred Wegener, a German explorer and meteorologist. In 1915, Wegener's book, The Origins of Continents and Oceans, was published. He wrote that a supercontinent called Pangaea had existed about 250 million years ago. Dr. Wegener theorized that Pangaea broke up into the 7 continents. It took a long time for this change to happen. Dr. Wegener called his theory continental drift. Wegener found the same plant and animal fossils on the different continents. For example, he found fossils of the fern Glossopteris in Africa, South America, India, Antarctica, and Australia. He also noted that South America and Africa fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Sadly, not everyone believed him. The scientific community shunned him for his radical ideas. You are a fool, Wegener. Impossible. Inconceivable. Someday, someone will prove me right. That will be me, Dr. Wegener. I'm Marie Tharp from Ypsilanti, Michigan, born on July 30th, 1920. I'm going to turn the world of geology upside down. And that she does. But first, she has to meet Bruce Hazen. Hello, my name is Bruce Hazen. I'm a graduate student here at Columbia. Are you Marie Tharp? Yes, I am Marie Tharp. I have some work for you. I hope it's not filing. Bruce had just returned from an expedition on board the ship Atlantis. I need you to plot sounding data of the ocean floor. I heard that you are good at math and can draft. I like to draft. Tell me a bit more about your soundings. The ships measure the depths using an echo sounder, which is a type of sonar. Sonar is short for sound, navigation, and ranging. The echo sounder transmits a sound wave or a ping through the water. It hits the seafloor and returns as an echo. The depths are recorded as echograms on scrolls of paper on the exact point along the ship's course. I'm going to move to the next one. Marie, I have thousands of miles of ship's tracks and thousands of echograms. I would rather be out on the ship than doing the hard work of organizing, calculating, and plotting all of this data. No problem, Bruce. I can handle it. We are going to make a great team. I'm going to map a picture of the ocean floor. This is my chance to speak to the earth. I'm going to move to the next one. This is after Marie does some research. You'll have to see in between. Look, there is a deep valley going down the center of the mid-Atlantic ridge. A V shape is present in each of the profiles I drew. This could be where the continents pulled apart. That's impossible, Marie. That would mean continental drift. Most of the scientific community disagrees with Wegener's theory. I can't risk my reputation on girl talk. You must have missed something. Map it again. I doubt it. I'll prove you wrong, Bruce. Bruce sailed off to collect more data. Since I was not allowed aboard a research ship, I went back to my drafting tables, piles of paper, and pen and ink. I felt like an ocean whose surface alone could be seen. Undaunted, I continued to piece together my underwater puzzle. I plotted the southern tracks of the ships between South America and Africa. There's that V shape again. Let's see what Bruce has to say about this. I showed Bruce the 6 notches in my 6 profiles from north to south in the Atlantic Ocean. This is a valley, not girl talk, Bruce. You expect me to believe that this Rift Valley demonstrates the possibility that one continent separated into 7 continents, as Wegener suggested? Yes, Bruce. It would also mean that there is the possibility that the sea floor is spreading and the continents are still moving? Yes, correct. This is scientific heresy. Perhaps it is the plain old truth. So that's just part of my story. here is a great portrait, a photo of the great Marie Tharp. I love that picture of her. And that's on the left. On the right, you see that is her at work, an actual photo of her at work with Bruce Hazen in the background. There are no computers in that picture. There were no satellites circling the globe at that time. All she just had tons and tons and tons of these echograms. And then she created this amazing maps. We can go to the next slide. These are those profiles that I mentioned. So all of these echograms created this just zigzagging mess of all of these crossings and all of these soundings that had been taken. And they were from many various ships. And she was the first person to just sit down and organize it. Somebody might have seen it or thought about it, but nobody really took the time to organize it into these 6 profiles where she could see the continuity of that Rift Valley in the profiles. And these are her originals, so they're beautiful. Next, please. And this is that first graphic diagram that she created. That Bruce said, go back to the drawing board. And she made this physiographic diagram. And as she was making it, she noticed she had a colleague, and the colleague was working on earthquake data for Bell Laboratories. And while Marie was working on this map and her colleague, Edward Foster, was working on the earthquake data, she noticed that the earthquakes followed along where she said her Rift Valley was. And that was really the proof, is she had that continuity between the earthquake data, the seismicity, and her Rift Valley. And we can go, isn't it beautiful? I love it. It's so beautiful. So next. And so Marie's work led her to map all of the oceans. And the culmination of her work with Hazen was this map, the World Ocean Floor Panorama, truly the first map ever to show the mountains under the sea. And it did change Earth science. And this was painted by the Austrian landscape painter, Heinrich Beran, who they hired to create this. And it's probably in every earth science lab or universities, departments in the United States. And this was the go-to map for quite some time, until I guess satellites and computers and other kind of mapping now gives us different pictures. So there it is. As you can tell, I'm very enthusiastic.
Thank you so much, Josie. So we now, to round out the panel, we asked 2 of our PhD students who've worked in oceanography. One's a current oceanography student, another one did her master's, mapping the chemistry along these volcanic vents along the seafloor, to join us to answer questions too. So we see you're putting questions in the Q&A panel, which is awesome, but I think I'll take the chance now to let Liz explain to you these collections of pictures and tell you about some of her adventures.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Can everybody hear me? Panelists, give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. So as Julie said, my name is Elizabeth Weidner. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm studying oceanography as part of a joint degree between the University of New Hampshire and Stockholm University in Sweden. I work here on campus at the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping, Joint Hydrographic Center, which is funded by NOAA and is one of the premier ocean mapping institutions in the world. And I guess that I would say that I'm an acoustical oceanographer. I use sonars, I use sound to study the ocean. And I've been in the field for probably, well, it's been more than a decade now. I started out at University of Washington in Seattle, where I got my Bachelor of Science in Oceanography and sort of my start in ocean mapping. And after graduation, I went to work as a geophysicist for a company called CNC Technologies. And I worked a lot in the field there, a lot of time on ships. It took me all over the United States to different bodies of water. I worked in some international locations as well. And through that work, I met my now academic advisors, Tom Weber and Larry Mayer, who are professors here at UNH. So I came to UNH, to the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping, to become a graduate student. I got my master's degree here in earth science, emphasis in ocean mapping. And my research for that was focused on acoustic methods for quantifying methane flux in the Arctic Ocean. And now I'm working on my PhD, and I basically took all of the equipment and the tools that I learned in my master's, and I'm just applying them to new oceanographic problems. So now I'm studying mixing in the ocean, mixing in the upper water column, and mixing associated with fluid emissions like those that you would find at black smokers, which are at mid-ocean ridges, kind of like what was just talked about, but also in glacial systems. And you can see in the photo here, one of the glacial systems, and the little boat in the lower left-hand corner is one of my acoustic data collection rigs. And my time at UNH, I've had the opportunity to go to sea quite a few times. I've been on over 10 expeditions. I work mostly in the Arctic Ocean and in the Baltic with association with Stockholm University, but I've been to the North Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Southern Ocean off of New Zealand. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that's some multi-beam data. That's sort of like the newest mapping technology, and that is of a mid-ocean ridge like those that were identified by Marie Tharp in that very early type of echo sounding. So yeah, I'm just really excited to be here and answer any questions, acoustics questions especially. That's my specialty. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Liz. And then our next panelist is Florencia Fahnestock, who can share her adventures along the East Pacific Rise.
Hi, everyone. Everyone hear me okay? I like Liz's tip. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the organizers of this event for inviting me. And thank you guys, everybody, for joining today. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself, more specifically about where I come from and how it is that I came to conduct research for my master's degree on the ocean floor. I was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I came to this country when I was about 7 years old. My family settled down in Southern California. I'm a Valley girl. I can trace my first scientific spark to middle school, where I first learned about plate tectonics. And during a school field trip, I vividly remember visiting a road cut exposing the San Andreas Fault and being fascinated by the concept of geologic time and how landscapes came to be. Around the same time, I began collecting rocks and beach sand. My mom would pick up shoe boxes and wonder why they were so heavy, only to find them full of rocks and sand specimens. In high school, I discovered chemistry and biology and really took to those subjects right away. And by the time I graduated high school, although I had some general knowledge about deep ocean environments, I, like Marie Tharp, as I found out today, never imagined that I would one day be conducting research on the ocean and even better, visit the bottom of the ocean twice. I completed my undergraduate degree in earth sciences at Boston University, where I discovered geochemistry, and I learned a lot about volcanoes, minerals, and deep earth processes. I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school, but even after 4 years of learning about different geochemical processes, I couldn't really narrow down my options. I couldn't decide whether I should study volcanoes and how deep earth processes work, or if I should study water quality and environmental contaminants. I was really torn about this. Well, I didn't exactly have to choose. Little did I know that there would be a really awesome opportunity here at UNH. I interviewed for graduate schools, but particularly at UNH, I met several professors and I heard about different opportunities for master's research. I met with Dr. Julie Bryce here in the panel today, and she told me about an opportunity to work with her and another professor, a world-renowned hydrothermal vent geochemist and oceanographer, Dr. Karen Von Dam, on a project linking deep earth processes like subsea floor volcanism to the composition of metals in these hydrothermal fluids, specifically at a location called the East Pacific Rise. I thought this was by far the most exciting project that I had ever heard of. I really could not have dreamt it up any better myself. So just remember to just be open to opportunities. The real cherry on top of this whole opportunity and sort of couple of years of my life was that the summer was kicked off, the summer after graduation from Boston University was kicked off with an email from Dr. Karen Von Dam asking me to join her team in like 2 weeks on a response cruise. Now this response cruise is a research cruise added to the schedule at the very last minute because there was new evidence of a very recent eruption. So I canceled my job opportunities, my office job that I had lined up for the summer, and I was out into the ocean on research vessel Atlantis for the very first time. So for my master's research, because of this new evidence of a recent eruption, I actually looked at multiple time points of sampling since that eruption. I went out to sea 3 times total and got to go to see the bottom of the ocean floor twice. And I looked at how different elements and compounds in hydrothermal fluids, specifically metals like lead and cadmium and zinc, were influenced by the eruption and how they changed over time since the eruption. And so I really, at the end, got the desire to study both water and volcanism in one beautiful and once in a lifetime research project. And I have for you some photographs of the research vessel Atlantis, Alvin, the submarine we used to explore and take our samples, myself and at the time lab mate and now professor at Lehigh University, Dr. Jill McDermott, in the Alvin, experiencing our first time sitting there, making sure that we weren't going to be claustrophobic. and they do that. They sit you there for a while, making sure you're going to be okay. And then you can see a photograph of the sampler and this one particular event, along with the temperature probe that sits there recording the temperature of the black smoker, the hydrothermal vent. And I'm happy to take any questions like Liz.
Okay, thanks, Flora. So if you guys have questions for the panelists, just general ocean questions, we'll do our best between those of us here. I think Professor Foster was going to ask Liz the first question, because it looks like the Q&A is a question for Liz. It's kind of about how we use echo sounders.
So once again, everybody, I remind you all to go to the question and answers and feel free to put a question or a thought and we can ask our panelists to speak on this. The question is, were there any corrections made to the echo sounder values to compensate for sound velocity and tide? And I'll respond first based on the data that Maria Tharp used, and it's my understanding that she used a fairly consistent estimate of the speed of sound. So the way in which sound travels through the water is a function of the water properties. Since that time, there have been quite a few advances, and I thought Liz could actually talk with us about how the maps of today and the maps of tomorrow will sort of adjust for changes in the speed of sound. Liz?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. Yeah, I would just say, so the first thing to keep in mind is that the speed of sound of the water column changes as a function of depth, like Diane said. You know, it's the properties of the water. And as you move down in the water column, the water's temperature changes, its salinity changes, the pressure increases, and there are a number of things that affect the speed of sound. And so what we normally do if we're out on a cruise is we take sound speed profiles, and those are collected a number of different ways. You can take an expendable sound speed profile, and that's called an XBT. I think if you saw the original flyer for this, you saw me holding kind of what looked like kind of a gun at the edge of a ship, and that's an XBT. So that basically, you send that out into the water and it feeds information back until it reaches the bottom, and then you basically just sort of cut the line and you add a little bit to the trash that's in the ocean by taking that profile. But that provides you with an running sound speed. You don't have to stop the ship. You also can stop the ship, and you can take a CTD profile, which is conductivity temperature depth sensor, and that provides you with a sound speed profile along with a lot of other oceanographic information. So those are the kind of profiles that are collected, and there's an online database that has profiles for different oceans, different depths, you know, coastal water, and also different times. And it's a huge database, and a lot of ocean models are based on those changing profiles through time. As far as echo sounders go, Marie Tharp's echo sounder was basically a single a single source echo sounder. It's just sent a pulse of sound down, straight down to the bottom of the seafloor, and then, you know, that sound reflected off the seafloor and primarily just returned, you know, back and forth, you know, a sort of a single wave vector. But nowadays we have things called multi-beam echo sounders that actually sound out, you know, in multiple directions, kind of creating, if you can imagine mowing your lawn, you sort of mow the sea floor and you collect data in this swath that is perpendicular to the ship direction. So if you're, you know, moving up the screen here, you would be collecting a swath that's skinny, very high resolution, following your ship track. And to do that, we have to account for all sorts of different things and how sound is bending through the water, what the sound speed profile looks like near the surface of the transducer versus through the water column. So it's super complicated. And there's a lot of research that's happening to use like machine learning to predict what the sound speed profile might look like or how it could be applied. So it's its own, if you're interested in that, that's its own field nowadays, and people are working on that. So yeah, and then tides is a separate thing. For most ocean going work, you don't actually apply a tidal correction just because the tides become more important when you're near shore. The resolution, the accuracy, I guess, of very deep echo sounding is the uncertainty is larger than the tidal variation in the open ocean. So you wouldn't really apply a tidal correction, but if you're near shore, especially if you're north on the north part of the east coast of the United States or into Canada, those tidal ranges can be, you know, upwards of 5 to 10 meters, I think. And so you definitely would need to account for tidal corrections, the time of day, when the data was collected, what season, all of that.
Thanks, Liz. So we have a second and a third question going. I'll take the second and then I'll tag team to Diane for the third. So we have a question. What is a geochemist? I believe that's for Flor. And then Florencia, maybe she can also explain these beautiful specimen that we're looking at here too.
Great, thank you. So a geochemist is a scientist that studies the earth, but looks at different earth processes, focusing in on the chemistry. So how the chemistry really impacts, drives those processes that they're studying. So if you are interested in what's in water, like a geochemist that focuses on water quality, may focus primarily on the composition within that water. So the elements in that water, reactions that happen in the water. There's also such a thing called a scientist called biogeochemist would look at the chemistry, but also the biology and how the biology and the chemistry interact together to explain an earth process. So hopefully that clarifies. And then the slide with the different specimens, these are all specimens from our archive. We've got some sulfides, and so I'm going to move left to right on my screen. So we've got the two samples sort of stacked on top of each other. Those are pieces of a chimney, essentially, that came off and were preserved. And you can kind of see all the different minerals that form. So as that really, really hot hydrothermal water comes out, it hits the very cold, it's to about 2 degrees Celsius water that these very hot fluids hit. And so when that happens, they immediately just precipitate or form these solid minerals. And so as these compounds accumulate, you start to form these structures. They're called sulfides, and you can see all the different layers of these. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can kind of see all the different features. You see different types of minerals depending on the composition of the fluid, depending on the temperature of the fluid. And so a lot of the different colors are different minerals. And then as we move to the right, you can see it's actually very clearly labeled Southern East Pacific Rise chimney wall. And so a piece of chimney, it tells you what the temperature was at the time that the hydrothermal fluid was sampled. And you can also see a lot of the different colors and the different minerals. And then you can see, if you go below at the 3 different photographs, you see how we label our samples. For example, this sample came from Atlantis Cruise 15-17, and this was a Jason sampled a rock, basalt, piece of basalt rock, and because it has a J on it. And so this was instead of Alvin, it was a remote operated vehicle. So we sometimes oceanographers that study the deep ocean can use Alvin to sample, or they can use other types of remote operated vehicles. And this is one case or one sample. And then in the hydrothermal systems, there's also some really interesting biological critters or animals that get their energy essentially from the hydrothermal fluids, so survive down there at this very extreme environment. And so these are some examples of what remains of these animals. And so in the case of a very large clam, you can see a large paper clip for scale. This is a large white clam. And then you can also see to the far right a tube worm casing. And those are just to show you a couple of specimens that we would collect and preserve after a research cruise.
Thank you, Florencia. One of the things that I find really interesting is that you both may study ocean processes, and yet you study very different things. And one of the next questions sort of starts to think about that. And this is for Josie. Josie, are there other women scientists that you might be thinking of for your next book? Will you be thinking about studying other female oceanographers or other female scientists?
The list is long. Way too long. And yes, I do have, right now I'm working on 2 stories, 2 very different scientists and 2 very different periods of time. And they're not oceanographers. One of them has, she's not a scientist necessarily, but she was an advocate for science. Not so very well known. I'm not allowed to say who it is. And the other scientist is definitely someone who made an amazing, amazing discovery and has been until recently forgotten. Her name wasn't even associated. As a matter of fact, I've become addicted to scientific journals, old scientific journals. And I was looking into this particular subject, and her name wasn't even listed along with the other scientists that made contributions, again, similar to Marie Tharp, whose name was basically erased from this discovery until recently.
Well,
So,
we would love to have you as an adopted oceanographer telling our stories.
I will, and I have others on my list. I just got to get my editors on board.
Sounds great. And Julie, I think you'll be introducing the next question.
Yeah, so there's a question from a 7th grader, which totally makes everybody's day here. So the question is, and I think this could go to, well, we'll send it to Liz. Do you get to choose which ocean you go to for studying, or how do you choose where to go?
Oh, that's a good question. So yes and no. Ocean cruises are very expensive. The ship time is expensive, and it takes a lot of planning, right? So cruises can take up to, half a decade sometimes to plan and get the funding for. So on some level, yes, we're very particular about where we choose to go. We have plans. We know who's going to go. We have plans in advance of what we're going to study and how we're going to study it. But in order to make the decisions about where you're going to go, you need to be involved in the process from the start, and often you're not a student. So often as a graduate student, so like Flora, when she was talking about going on the Atlantis or any of the cruises that I've gone on, I was able to go on those cruises because my advisors were involved in the process, or they knew someone in the process, and I was sent, to either help with the research, or I had a specific research plan. So I've had the opportunity to plan some research and choose very specifically where I'd like to go, but I also have been asked, kind of like Flora said, she was asked like 2 weeks before the cruise happened. One time I came in and someone asked me if I was willing to go on a 6-week cruise the next day, and I had to go home and get packed just so I could go to sea. So yes and no, we pick, but maybe as a student, you might not have as much control over where you get to go, if that's a good way of answering that question.
So Flora, I'd like to get, as you're sort of responding to what Liz said, it would also be nice to know, how long do you go when you go out to sea? How long do the cruises last?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it really varies on the type of research vessel that you're on. And so, for example, in my experience, the response cruise, because it was a very quick cruise thrown together at the very last minute, it was actually just, I think, under 2 weeks. And the number of dives, the number of days we had to utilize Alvin was just 6 dives total, because again, it was just squeezed in on already a very busy schedule. But the other 2 cruises that I went on later after the response cruise, those were closer to 3 week and total. That includes the ship sailing out to the location and then all of the diving and then returning. So I was gone about 3 weeks, both those second times. And then also it really varies, like I said, on the research vessel, because sometimes you have, I think, research vessels that go out for months, depending on what they're doing. If their primary focus is mapping, they might be gone for multiple months, and really utilize that ship time and utilize the opportunity to do many tracks, and that takes a lot of time. And so you can be gone anywhere from a couple weeks to months if you are an oceanographer and an ocean explorer.
Great.
I would just comment that my maximum amount of time at sea is 3 months and 24 days straight at sea.
Wow.
So, but that's very long and probably a little bit unusual. Although there was a Mosaic cruise, the German icebreaker Polarstern went up into the Arctic, and they connected themselves to the ice, and they actually stayed in the ice. They're supposed to stay for a whole year, and they actually flew helicopters out to change out their crew and bring them back to land. But I think the ship itself was supposed to be in the ice for a whole year.
If I can follow up on that, some of us actually study some of these processes, not by actually going out to sea, but we do it from the coastline. And so there are many different ways you can actually explore the ocean. Some of it is via ship, and some of it is going in through places like you see behind me, which is Hampton.
Great. And some of us work on samples back on the land too, the land-based scientists. So I think, let's see, I'm going to jump a question and then come back to this other really good one. But there's a question from the audience for Liz and Flora: is when you go to sea or you're in the field, do you work on your own research, or do people help each other? How does that work?
So I went to Northern Greenland. That's where this photo that you're seeing in the background is from. And that was in the summer of 2019. And that was a big expedition. There were 11 different work packages, which means there was everything from geochemistry, like Flora was talking about, to there was an anthropology group that was going on to the land that we were nearby. They were flying via helicopter, and they were looking for ancient sites, basically like paleo sites of human campgrounds. And when you go out to sea, your job, the way that I've always been told, is to collect the best data set possible, because sea time is very expensive, and you often go to places that are very difficult to get to. So in a lot of ways, you're almost kind of like a cog in the machine. You really do help everybody out as much as you can. And I mean, you often have your own projects. It really, like I said before, it sort of depends on what your scientific level is. And you might spend almost none of the time at sea doing your own stuff. Your project might be just a few hours of time. Maybe you're part of a dive, like Flora was talking about, and you're there to collect a very specific sample. But the cruise exists much longer than that one dive. When I was in Greenland, I went out on a small vessel that lived on the icebreaker's deck in a cradle, and they lifted it up and they put me in the water with a couple of people, and I went out and I collected some acoustic data. And it only lasted for 11 hours. And that was my data set. But I helped, I sat a shift. I've had 2 4-hour shifts every day. And I helped collect acoustic data. So then I was assisting others. I also collected, water samples in my free time. So you sort of get your hands into everything. I'm sure Flora can speak to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my experience, so for example, if you were on an Alvin dive, you can only fit 3 people in Alvin, so the pilot and then 2 scientists. And a lot of times, the chief scientist that I was with, primarily Dr. Karen Von Dam, she always made it a point to include students. So you always had maybe one professor or one like much higher up senior scientist, and then a student, a master's student, a PhD student, a postdoc. And so your responsibility for that whole dive was to collect all the samples for everybody on the vessel. And so that included microbiologists, that included macrobiologists, so people who studied the animals on the seafloor. That included all the different types of geochemists. You might have multiple geochemists on board. And it also would be including petrologists, so scientists who study the rocks. And so you were collecting rocks, you were collecting the waters, you were collecting the biological specimens. And so you had to take care to take the samples and the notes in the same way that you would if they were for yourself. And so in that regard, you were a very large part of the team. When you got your samples, or whether you were waiting for the samples on the ship, or whether you came back from Alvin and went into the designated lab area, because inside of the ship there's a lot of space for different labs to set up, different laboratories to set up space for their different types of equipment. You would then go into the lab group that you were a part of. But again, you are maybe a part of a group of maybe 4 or 5, maybe it's just a couple, maybe it's a small lab group, that's okay too, but maybe you were a part of 4 or 5 other lab members, and each of you does different types of subsamples from a primary sample. So again, you would be working on specific samples, but also contributing to help with your other colleagues within your lab to carry out their research, because there's a lot to do on the ship, and you don't really have time to do anything else. You're there basically to do this really awesome research. And in the case of Atlantis, where I was on, during the day, Alvin would get to dive, but during the night, there was a whole other night shift where something called a tow cam was lowered. And Dr. Dan Fernari, a professor that I worked with, he and his team would deploy the tow cam, and they would survey the bottom of the ocean. So there was this whole camera system that was taking even more information at night. So you have a 24/7 opportunities to collect data. And so if you wanted to, or if you had any energy left after dealing with your own samples, you could go into the area where the tow cam images and videos were coming out, and you could learn about that. So it's really awesome. And then the most amazing part is that because, and kind of when I was explaining the whole biogeochemistry, everything, the physics, the chemistry, the seismology, for example, all of that really just informs each other. And so you need each other in order to paint a really good picture of what's happening. It's not just the one field or one area. A lot of the really awesome advances are when you combine a lot of these fields to really paint a good picture, really study what's happening in a system, especially one as complex as the ocean.
Thanks, Flor. Thanks, Liz. We have a couple of other questions. Another question from another 7th grader. What other ocean jobs are there, and what other jobs have you done? And I guess I'll start with that one. I'm a nearshore scientist, and I study the interaction between waves and beaches. And some may describe that as me getting paid to go to the beach. And that seems like it's a lot of fun. But in fact, they're really important questions. One of the projects I have looks for unexploded ordnances and munitions that may have been deposited on beaches decades ago that suddenly find their way into coastal waters. We need to understand how our beaches will change to increasing sea level and increasing storms, and whether people have to move their houses. But I think as we look beyond that, and we look beyond the work that Liz has done and Flora's done, we need to remember that we need scientists and engineers that are thinking about new sources of energy and ocean renewable energy, whether that's offshore wind or whether that's energy from the tides. We need to think about people that are helping feed the planet. We know that many of our world population relies on seafood as their primary source of protein. And that's going to mean new strategies for assessing fisheries. It's going to mean new strategies for aquaculture systems. We need people that are understanding how our oceans are changing. The Gulf of Maine is warming at a rate faster than nearly the rest of the globe. And what that means is that our fisheries are going to change in time. And we know that there's changes in the ocean chemistry. We call that ocean acidification. That's really important to development of shells. And you may know that lobsters are really important here locally. And we need to understand what the impact of ocean acidification is on lobsters. So I think that I personally would like you to walk away from this thinking and knowing that the opportunities are limitless, and you can take a passion in biology or chemistry or math or physics or social science, how we interact with people. And you can do that and apply that to change the way we view and use and explore and consider our oceans.
Beautiful.
I think Julie's going to tee up one of the next questions.
Yep. So I think there's a question that Josie got out a little bit, but maybe you thought about it somewhere. So you have 2 projects, but are there other women scientists whose work has been overlooked that we should know about?
Oh, I don't know if it's so much overlooked, but people might not know a lot about I'm a big fan of Sylvia Earle. And if you just go on to Twitter, I'm telling you, there are a wealth of scientists out there tweeting about their work daily, and I follow them. And one of them is Dawn Wright. And I love to see what she is up to. And she has been named one of the 50 top explorers this year in the Explorer magazine, right? And she is marvelous to follow. A lot of times I just go on to universities, I go onto their websites and I look and read about what some of those scientists do. I have books here by, I'm gonna just grab one, give me one second. Have it right here. If you're interested in reading some books, here is Cindy Lee Van Dover. And she writes some great stories about, here's one, The Octopus's Garden. And she writes some fascinating stories about her experiences in Alvin and what she sees at the bottom of the sea. So yes, there are, I am constantly reading about and looking into women in science, and especially women that study the ocean. So there's lots out there. Go explore.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Diane.
Okay, we have another technical question, and I think this would probably be a good question for Liz. Liz, what can you tell us about the ways in which people can use, and scientists and engineers can use remote controlled boats to scan the bottom? And why do you need to go into these things called Alvin, which we know to be small submarines? So when would you choose to use a remote controlled boat, and when would you choose to go yourself?
Oh yeah, well, that's a huge question. So remote controlled boats or autonomous boats, a lot of oceanographers think in some ways are the future. The ocean is a huge place. I'm sure you've heard that we've only really mapped, a very small portion of our oceans, and ship time is expensive, people's time is expensive, but robots, their time is not expensive, provided that they do what we expect them to do. So I think there are a lot of reasons to use a remote vessel, Jason. So there are different levels. There are submarines, which is what Flor went into, right? And she went down, and many have gone down to the bottom, and they collect samples. And that is really positive because you can visually, see the bottom, you can pick out the samples you want, you're able to, move the remotes and collect exactly, you're right there. There's a visual identification. But remotely operated vessels like Jason, are sort of the same thing, except for they just have a bunch of super cool high definition cameras on them, and they go down and they have like remote arms. They have all sorts of different appendages to collect data. They collect push cores. I even saw one that had an appendage that was like one of those balls that you squish when you're kind of stressed out, right? It has like the little beads in it, and they would push it up against an object that was soft, and then they would pull all the air out of it, and it would connect to the object, and it would pull it off the floor without breaking it. Because you can imagine if you had like a really like a, you know, a grabber arm. You might rip the sea sponge in half or something like that. But so vehicles allow us to go down, and it costs less to use remote vehicles than to use humans. And then autonomy can cost even less than using remotely operated vehicles, provided the vehicles don't run themselves into the sea floor. So I think the future in a lot of ways, especially of mapping, is autonomy. It's very exciting, the future of autonomy. And I think, you know, it's a rapidly changing field. So if you're, you know, out there and you're in 7th grade or you're in 6th grade or you're in high school and you're interested in oceanography and you're interested in robots, I would definitely say, you know, chart that path, because that's going to be the future of oceanography for sure. Data collection in oceanography is going to be all robots.
Wow.
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to kind of lace together two questions and bundle them, and maybe we'll pitch it to Flor and then to Liz, but after that. But are there areas of the ocean you haven't explored that you'd like to, as a first question? And then the second part of it is, what are some obstacles to your work at sea, and how long does it take you to get the research questions answered?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think it can take, depending on the question, I'll start with the second half of the question. It can take, you know, decades or more, some depending on the question. So for example, the processes that I was studying, many people are obviously still studying a lot of the same things that I was looking at. Because you can focus in on one particular area, but then you also want to go to a bunch of other areas too, and see that you find see if you find similarities or differences. And so a lot of current and former ocean explorers go to a lot of different types of hydrothermal vent areas and compare them and see what changes they observe across all the different types, but also what the major similarities are. And so to achieve this, to collect this type of data set, to make, to really be able to see these observations, to answer these types of hypotheses can take years to decades. But every nugget of research is important and is a contribution to the larger picture. And so you have folks that come in for a few years in their academic life, and they make very important contributions. And then you have people who work on them for their whole lives, and they make obviously very large contributions. And they utilize the work of all of the smaller bits of work to make these big ideas. And so that's one way to look at it, is that it can take it can take a couple of years to do a master's project and contribute, or it can take 4, 5, 6 years for a PhD, or it could take, decades. There's just every time that there's a question and you think you're getting close to answering it, or to compiling information to paint a picture of what you're trying to understand, there's oftentimes a lot more questions that arise from that. And so it's kind of this beautiful process of always having the next thing that you want to understand. And technology certainly helps to spur on questions. When you suddenly have the ability to measure something that you couldn't measure before, that really suddenly opens up a lot of new opportunities and new areas of research. And then your question about future places. So I currently study climate change and mercury in the environment in the Arctic. And so I haven't been going out to sea, and I haven't really thought about where I would want to go to sea in the future. But I do think that the Marianas Trench is a really fascinating area, and it's very deep.
That's amazing.
That would be really awesome to one day.
Wow.
But maybe Liz wants to share what her future location might be.
Sure, yes. I've actually been to the Marianas Trench, and I've swam in the water above the deepest part of the ocean, which is very disconcerting. Wasn't really an enjoyable. I felt very nervous the whole time. I have been to the Arctic a few times, but I would like to go back. I would like to get all the way to the North Pole. There are several expeditions that have been there in recent years. My advisor, Larry, has been to the North Pole. Several researchers from UNH have. So yeah, I definitely would love to go to the North Pole. I'm not sure there's actually that much happening at the North Pole, in terms of research for me, but but that just seems like a really exciting place to say that you have been. As far as obstacles to my job at sea, one thing I would say is when I work in the Arctic, there is ice in the Arctic. And you probably have heard that the ice pack has been decreasing, but there is a seasonal ice pack that exists in the Arctic. And that can make your job difficult if there's ice in the way. So I've been on a number of icebreakers, the Swedish icebreaker Odin, the Canadian icebreaker, the Louis St. Laurent, and the US icebreaker Healy. And I would say that one of the biggest obstacles is trying to get to the place that you'd like to study. And that is actually becoming easier in some ways because of global warming. That's not necessarily a good thing, but because the ice pack is being reduced, especially in the summer months, it's opening up new locations for research to happen, basically for research to happen easier because you don't need to fight your way through the ice pack in an icebreaker, because an icebreaker can't just, drive through ice. It actually drives up onto the ice and it crushes it, and then it backs up. And then it drives up onto the ice and it crushes it and it backs up. And so if you're on an icebreaker, it's just a continuous back and forth motion and everything vibrates, and it can be quite difficult to sleep and to do science. So yeah, global warming is definitely a negative, but it is allowing us to get to some places that we haven't been able to go to before.
So I think in looking at the time, we probably should, we tried to answer a few of the questions in the chat as we can, about great questions about what animals are being impacted by ocean warming and ocean acidification. We are, I think the ocean jobs you get to decide is really, I'm going to answer for Florencia and Liz. It's really what you want to do is what you decide to study. And that's what's cool about oceanography, is there are lots of different choices. That's true in earth sciences as well. And then there's a thank you to you, Josie, for unearthing these stories and reminding us about them today. But I think Professor Foster wanted to take us out to talk a little bit about Ocean Discovery Day that we have every year here at the university. And just to follow up, that we will be reaching out with the information about the recorded version of this. Thanks very much to Tara Hicks-Johnson and Chris, who are behind the scenes making this work. But we'll reach out and we'll provide some more resources. So thank you for joining us. So Professor Foster, over to you.
Thanks. I've learned a lot, and I have renewed my love for the ocean and why I chose the path that I chose. So thank you, Josie, for writing the important books that you do, and Flor and Liz for actually sort of being passionate about what you do and changing the world we live in and the way we understand it. Many of you are going to walk away from today and you're going to think about hopefully something that you haven't thought about before, or what might be next. And I think one of the things we'd really like you to do is recognize there are many opportunities across the earth and ocean sciences. There are many opportunities at the University of New Hampshire. We are ranked 12th in federal research funding in marine sciences, and about the same in earth sciences. So the work we do is important and it's nationally recognized. Find ways of getting engaged. Go to Nature Groupie and join one of the volunteer programs. Come to Ocean Discovery Day in the fall. Come to one of our public programs. There are many opportunities. Tara Hicks-Johnson does so many outreach events with many of you. So please do keep finding new passions and following existing ones. With that, I think we'll say thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
panelists. Thanks, Josie.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.